In this video, we are going to add some texture to this brush that we created in our last video, this render brush. You can see I have my render brush selected here. If I start with a soft gradient across my screen here, you can see how it's responding. So that behavior is something that I'd like to maintain. But let's say I would like to add some texture rather than this smooth, soft gradient. With my render brush still selected, I'm going to come over to my brushes panel. I'm going to choose a different brush tip shape. Currently, I'm at the default soft round, but I can change that brush tip at any time. I'm just going to scroll down until I find something a little bit more textured. This one here looks interesting. I'm going to increase the size of this brush so I can see this a little bit better. And you can see as I draw my gradient across my page here, you can see that it has some natural texture built into the tip of that brush. But there's another way of adding textures to our Photoshop brushes that I prefer to just choosing a different brush tip shape. I'm going to load my SL render brush again. And this time I'm going to add texture in a different way. Here in my brushes panel, you can see that there is a textures tab, and I'm going to click and turn that on. In this panel, we have the ability to create a texture. Now, currently there is no texture selected. I'm going to click on this disclosure triangle here. And you can see I have a set of textures preloaded. If you don't see what I see, that's because you probably have Photoshop's default textures loaded. If you want to load these textures, just click on this gear icon here. And in this contextual menu, come down to erodible textures. I really like these textures. Say OK. Now you'll see what I've got here. You can play around with these various textures, but the one that I want to play with is this one here. If I hold over it, you can see it's telling me that it's cold press texture. That's what I want. With that selected, you may notice a slight update in our preview window down here. I'm going to scale up that texture just a little bit more so we can see this texture even more clearly in our preview. Now these next two sliders, brightness and contrast, will really be seen when we change something else first. I'm going to come down to the bottom here and I'm going to change the depth slider and bring that down to something much less. And now we can start to see the individual peaks and valleys of our texture. Now it's with these sliders, the brightness and contrast, that allows us to really refine what we're seeing here in our preview window. And you can see what's happening to our brush now. If we press with a normal weight, this brush will just scumble across the quote-unquote surface of our texture. I'm going to set it something like that. The next thing I'm going to make sure that I change is the control. This is the master control for the texture, and currently it's just set to off, meaning it will always give the same sort of texture no matter how hard you push. But I can set this to pen pressure so that now I can control just how much texture is displayed with our brush just by playing with pressure. I'm going to close that brushes panel. Now with that brush selected, I'm just going to draw a quick little gradient across my page here, getting gradually more heavy. And as I press further and further, you can see how that brush is starting to build into that texture. Now I've got it set to a point where even at my hardest pressure, I really can't fill that in. Sometimes you want that. So I can come back here to my brushes panel and I can change some of my brightness settings. I'm going to bring my brightness down and you can see what happens here. Now the central part of my preview and my brush here is starting to fill in. I'm still maintaining texture on the outside, but let's see how that works now if I draw a gradient across my screen. Okay, very light pressure, but gradually more pressure to the point where when I press heavily, I can fill in that texture. Now, I like to be able to work this way where I can go from light pressure, scumbling across the surface, and filling in my texture. Well, that's not bad, but I'm still working with a soft round brush. What would this look like if I changed my brush tip? I'm going to come back to my brushes panel. I'm going to change my brush tip to something that looks more like, well, this Conte crayon. Let's increase my brush size. I'm just going to work down this way, create a gradient that goes from top to bottom and getting gradually heavier until I can fill in my texture. Okay, I don't mind that. That's a nice responsive texture brush. I might want to experiment with a few others just to see what else I can get. But there's one last thing that I like to do with my texture brushes, and that's sometimes adding a dual brush. I'm going to click on the dual brush tab, and I'm going to come down to, again, something that looks a little bit more textured. That's kind of interesting. And you'll notice that the mode is currently set to color burn. And what I've noticed with the brush that has got a dual brush set up in this way, when I start drawing with this brush, you can see that this has some really nice responsiveness. And I really like the shape of this brush. It has a very natural edge to it. It feels much more like a piece of chalk pastel that I'm using. This brush is a wonderful chalk pastel sort of feel to it. And this is a brush that I want to save. I'm going to come over to my Tool Presets panel, and I'm going to save this as a new tool preset. Of course, I'm going to give this a descriptive name. Again, I'm going to start with my initials so I know it's something I've made, underscore texture. Now, I actually happen to have a few texture brushes already. I'm going to call this Texture Pastel 2. I'm going to say OK. There, I now have this particular textured brush selected. So let me just clear my canvas here and start fresh. Now I could start my next illustration using this lovely responsive chalk pastel. But one thing I find is that if I start an illustration with a very textured brush, the texture almost takes over. So what I like to do is I like to add my textured brushes to the end of my illustrations. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to open up this illustration here, and you can see that the skin tones have been handled in a very smooth way. And I believe I was using mostly my render brush for that. But as I started getting to the point where I was going to add my highlights, I switched over to one of my textured brushes. And you can see by doing so, we've added not only the highlight, but we've suggested some texture within the subject itself. Let's take a look at another example. This illustration was created mostly in Illustrator, but I wanted to soften some of these hard edges using my texture brush. The texture brush, when used selectively, can really enhance your illustrations.